Thank you, Professor Wu. That was a very good and a broad introduction of the IUFRO and what the task force stands for. And that was a very detailed introduction. Thank you for setting the stage and highlighting the importance of integrating science, policy, and value chains in forest carbon management through the main IUFRO and also our carbon 3S task force. Thank you very much. We now move to our first keynote speaker presentation. First of all, I would like to inform the listeners that we have a Q&A session, and our first keynote speaker has requested that we we write down our questions so that he can address the questions on his presentation immediately he finishes his presentation. So it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Jack Putz from the University of Florida, who will speak on totally additional and leakage-free carbon removal increases and emission reductions from improved tropical forest management. So Professor Putz is internationally recognized for his work on tropical forest ecology and sustainable forest management. Professor Putz, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you for the introduction and the introduction to the IUFRO program. It's my pleasure to address you today, some of you in the evening, some in the morning, and everything in between. I want to focus on the topic that has guided my career, which is trying to promote the conversion of tropical forest exploitation for timber into natural forest management. So the transition from exploitation to management. And the focus today is on using carbon markets to promote that transition. And I should say in advance that I have not been very successful in either regard, in either converting or changing forest exploitation to forest management, nor in using carbon markets to promote that transition. But here we go. It's I'm putting on the table for consideration and discussion two approaches to increasing or decreasing carbon emissions from forests that are harvested for timber, and increasing carbon removals or carbon sequestration or forest regrowth after harvesting. So this is what I've been doing. But my focus, I think one of the mistakes that I've made, and I've made several, is that I have tended to focus on the stand level or the forest level and not on forest landscapes. And recently, the last decade or two, I've stepped back and recognized that given global demand for wood, my natural forest management, or sometimes called extensive forest management or close to nature silviculture, was not going to yield all the wood that's needed by society. So I have somewhat reluctantly...
Jack, this is Marco. We can't see the slides. I'm very sorry.
You can't see the slides. Okay. You should be able to see the slides. I'm screen sharing.
We see your file manager with PowerPoint. Now it starts to appear.
Now we can see.
Now you can see?
Perfect.
Okay. Well, you could hear me. What you're looking at in this cover slide or the lead slide is not reduced impact logging, but it's a scene that you see far too often in the tropics. And my focus is on this extensive forest management with full recognition that we need intensively managed plantations. I mean, in one of the forests that I participate in management, we might get 1 or 2 cubic meters per hectare per year of timber production, whereas in plantations in Brazil or Indonesia, you can get well more than an order of magnitude more than that. Given the demand for wood, we need those plantations. We also need protected areas, because one of the drivers for me is biodiversity retention. And protected areas that require some management are keystone or core for that biodiversity protection. But I'll argue that well-managed natural forests also retain a great deal of biodiversity as well. So we have, just for simplification, these three intensities of forest land management. And I'm talking only about the forested landscape, not the agricultural landscape or the urban landscape. And each of those uses of forest land, from, in this case, 5 different options, from protected areas in dark green, natural forest management in the white, and plantations, community forests, and forest restoration. But let me just focus on 2 of these. The intensively the protected areas in green, where you have a lot of biodiversity but not no production of wood. This is in the bottom left-hand corner. These hexagons or polygons, I portray 6 different values from the forest. Now, you could have other values, like financial income is another option. The outer perimeter of these polygons is the best possible management option. The polygon inside the outside of the hexagon is what we expect to get from that forest use. The top is a plantation where you get a lot of wood, but wood, if you're producing a lot of wood, you're using a lot of water. If you're producing a lot of wood, then biodiversity becomes weeds and pests. So you do what you can to control that biodiversity or limit it. In the bottom right is the polygon for natural forest management, where you're getting wood, not as much as from a plantation. You also have the opportunity to harvest non-timber forest products. Water yields, if it's well managed, should be the same as in a protected area. Carbon can be substantial as well. I think our job as researchers is to inform these trade-offs, is to determine for a particular intervention, and here this is just generalized, for a particular intervention, what are those trade-offs? How much less wood, how much less biodiversity, and which elements of biodiversity are you losing with these different options? Because if we're going to plan at the landscape level, then we need to know what the trade-offs are for each of those interventions. And this planning would have to be done on a smaller scale as well, looking at the 100 or 1,000 hectare level. For example, in natural forest management, we have different options. For example, enrichment planting, where the species for which the forest is managed is depleted. Enrichment planting can work. It's expensive, and it doesn't make financial sense to carry it out more than, say, 200 meters from roads, because you need access to your enrichment planted areas for at least a few years until the trees are well established. So there are different scales of planning and different options, but each of those options, including the option of not doing anything, have trade-offs. And those are what I think we should be clarifying. Let's see now. Okay. Well, in natural forest management, one of the most familiar interventions is changing harvesting practices. And this is well known. It has been known for 50 years, at least since industrial logging started, really. There were advocates of planning of skid trails, as you see here. The proportion of the ground surface that's affected by skid trails can be reduced substantially, down to 3 or 4% in a selectively logged forest, if the skid trails are planned and the workers are supervised. And this happens. I've seen it now several times, that concessions, 3 in Gabon and 1 in Brazil, where skid trails were planned and workers were trained, and most importantly, workers were rewarded for following reduced impact logging guidelines. The guidelines are well known. The claims of reduced impact logging are widespread. Sometimes any logging is called reduced impact logging or sustainable logging, but we know that's not the case. But we also know that there are places where roads are very narrow and made in a way that allows them to be closed but then opened again. They're part of the permanent infrastructure. This is a trade-off, a long-term trade-off, but they cover a small proportion of the landscape. So reduced impact logging is possible, but we were interested in how much across the board, how much reduced impact logging practices were being implemented. In Indonesia, where there's been millions of dollars invested in reduced impact logging over the past decades, the Tropical Forest Foundation doing training, other groups doing training. There's been a lot of investment in forest certification and subsidies for concessions getting certified. Well, we wanted to know how well are we doing, a real impact evaluation. So we went into 25, with a group of Indonesian researchers, went into 25 logging concessions in Kalimantan and Papuan provinces, on the left and the center of this complicated graph that I'll walk through. And we used what's called the reduced impact logging protocols for assessing the carbon emissions due to selective logging. And we express those carbon emissions on the y-axis as megagrams of carbon per megagram of carbon harvested in the timber. And we actually, in the paper by Hermudinantu et al., I hope you look at, we present the data in other ways, but presenting emissions data as a function of harvesting intensity, always emissions are going to increase if you harvest more timber. Comparing Kalimantan and Papua is difficult because the timber harvested in Papua is more dense, mostly merbau or Insia species. So a cubic meter could weigh twice as much in Papua as in Kalimantan. So this unit of megagrams per megagram makes sense for comparative purposes. And then the Real C protocol allows you to differentiate the sources of emissions from going down from the top of these columns from felled tree remainder. So that's what's left of the tree that's felled, felling collateral damage, skidding, haul roads, and log yards. In Kalimantan on the left and in the center as well, we have existing practices. So this is the 15 logging concessions that we studied in Kalimantan. On the right is of the logging concessions using the concession that was the best at felling or the best at skidding to say what was possible, what have the Indonesian companies demonstrated was possible, and that's what would be the emissions if they all did that. And this is the emissions in megagrams per megagram of timber harvested under reduced impact logging practices. The same for Papua. Lots of detail here that I can't go into, but let's go off to the right-hand side where with the 2 green columns. On the left, representing existing practices, on the right, the 5 best concessions on each of these techniques. And what we see is that if these concessions had been using all the real practices, directional felling, low stumps, planned skid trails, narrow roads, and so forth, they would have saved 60% more carbon, kept it from the atmosphere. Another way you could say is that they're only using 40%, effectively using only 40% of the real practices. We compared FSC certified and non-certified concessions and found no difference, which is upsetting. But if you've been on a recent audit, you realize that the auditors don't have time to look at logging practices, and maybe they're not trained to recognize what reduced impact logging looks like. And there are variations, I know, I was really impressed in Gabon at the rigor of the audits, but not so in Indonesia. Even worse, because I've invested so much in real training and capacity building, we see no effect of real training on emissions. But none of the companies in Indonesia are professionalizing their workers and rewarding them financially for application of reduced impact logging practices. So maybe it's no surprise, and that's something on which more research investigation is needed of how to reward workers for applying what they've been trained to apply. And we are also looking at alternatives to ground-based yarding as logging, especially in Kalimantan, gets onto steeper and steeper ground. We're experimenting with a modified excavator for long line cable yarding. This is familiar in Malaysia, but hasn't been studied in Indonesia. So we're in the midst of that. And it's promising, but again, there are always trade-offs. And even if reduced impact logging practices are utilized, yields decline. I mean, this simple graph of harvestable timber over time with 30-year cutting cycles is pretty typical of what you'd find, what has been found across the tropics. I mean, you can modify this by harvesting smaller trees or harvesting new species or harvesting trees with lower quality wood and so forth. Or you can increase the harvest cycles to 60 years, which is how long it would take for the original volume to recover. Or you could say, okay, we don't expect the volume to recover to what it was in the primary forest, but we'll keep it at some lower level. But what hasn't been much focused on is the benefit of increasing the rate of forest growth and timber volume increments and carbon sequestration. And we have research that shows the benefits of many different kinds of silvicultural interventions on that, on growth, on tree growth. But I'm going to focus on one, my favorite, the lianas. And lianas are woody vines. We know from hundreds of research projects that lianas are bad for trees. Now, before I go any further, I want to make clear that I fully recognize that lianas are critical for biodiversity. First of all, they are as biodiverse as the trees that support them. Secondly, the lianas are providing wildlife, insects, mammals, birds with food and nesting opportunities, and most importantly, access to the canopy, the crowns of trees that would otherwise be inaccessible by non-flying or non-volant canopy animals. So they're a really important component, and I would never advocate for 100% liana cutting because of their biodiversity importance. But we also know that trees that are liana infested, badly liana infested, on average grow half as fast as trees that are liana free. If you liberate a tree from lianas, we'll just assume that it doubles in growth rate. Sometimes it's more than that, sometimes it's less. Trees with lianas are typically shorter and often have deformed boles. So from a timber perspective, they're also problematic. But rather than cutting all the lianas. We have focused on cutting lianas on what are called future crop trees. Let me step back a minute. We know that in uneven aged forests with selective logging, the next harvest, whether it's in 30 years or 50 years, is going to be from trees, mostly from trees that are already there at the time of the first harvest. They might be 20 or 40 centimeters in diameter, smaller than the minimum cutting diameter, but of species and with good form that they're going to grow into timber trees, only that they are doing that too slowly to sustain timber yields. And one of the reasons for that is liana infestations. So lianas around the world are increasing in abundance due to disturbances like selective logging, but also due to global climate change. There are changes in the climate that seem to favor lianas over trees. So lianas are getting more abundant, and with every harvest from a forest, they get more abundant. So often, you might have 25% of the trees in a primary forest liana infested. By the time you've harvested once, it's up to 60% of the trees. So, but whatever it is, we're advocating the cutting of liberating from lianas 5 to 10 future crop trees per hectare. And what we've graphed over on the right is, this is just modeling from data from the literature, that years after liana cutting and the cumulative carbon sequestered by 5 future crop trees. The dashed line is trees on which the lianas were cut. And with this basic data, we find that by 30 years, there are 3.3 megagrams of carbon dioxide per hectare additional that's sequestered by those trees. There's also couple cubic meters more wood produced by those trees as well. And what's remarkable about this intervention is its low cost. If it's done at the time of inventory data collection, which is usually a year, 9 months, a year before harvest, adding an additional worker or having the workers in the field for a little bit longer is not very expensive. 2 different studies show that it costs about 20 US cents per tree to liberate a tree from liana infestation. So that's for 5 future crop trees, that's $1 per hectare. And if you just take a very small, a very low carbon sale price of $10 per cubic meter, this is an amazingly favorable investment. It costs little to start with. Even if you discount it at 5%, it's still, the profit margin from this is fantastic. Well, what concerns me is that this is well known. I mean, forest workers know that lianas slow tree growth rates and cause them to deformities. We know in the reduced impact logging world that planting skid trails and training workers and rewarding them for cutting low stumps and not breaking a lot of trees, protecting future crop trees. We know these things work, but I proposed reduced impact logging as a carbon offset, that's what they were called then, in 1993. And I've yet to sell a single carbon credit from reduced impact logging. Maybe it's going to happen. I mean, there are people talking about it all over the world, but it hasn't happened yet. I'll continue to hope that it will happen soon. I have even more hope for the liana cutting intervention because it is low tech, just need a machete. Workers understand it. We have a method for monitoring its impacts with an internal and dynamic baseline, just having monitored blocks where half the future crop trees are liberated from lianas and half are left liana infested, with paint lines to monitor their growth response. It's an internal baseline that's dynamic. Conditions are changing, trees grow at different rates. Having a baseline within a forest should appeal to buyers of carbon credits. And I'm hoping that happens any day, but it hasn't happened yet. And Denver, Cayetano, working in Belize, is showing that they're actually, when you cut the lianas on a future crop tree, the benefits spill over to neighboring trees. And that's just an added advantage. The liana cutting operation, I focus mostly on timber production, but in a forest that's been degraded by bad logging, and trees are badly liana infested. Lianas could be cut on trees that produce fruit for wildlife or for people. In the case of these princes of fruits, the durian. Fruit production increases when trees are liberated from lianas. And these kinds of interventions, it could be for amenity value or spiritual value or whatever else, as long as it's done selectively, the impacts on these canopy animals that need lianas would be minimal. And I think that this approach to forest management rather than forest exploitation is very achievable. And once for the people who determine the fates of forest make the shift from just exploiting the forest to managing it, that's a major change that we're trying to stimulate. And hopefully this intervention will help in making that transition. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Professor Putz, for that insightful presentation on additionality and leakage, which are two critical dimensions in credible carbon accounting. And the most interesting one for me is the liana cutting in the selectively logged forests, which leads to both the increase in carbon and the yields. Thank you very much for the good work. We now welcome the questions from the chat, from the Q&A, and Professor Maku will be reading the questions.
Yes, please ask questions. Write your questions to the Q&A. I was Marco from the University of Helsinki. Welcome on my behalf also to the webinar. Since there are no questions yet, I would ask Jack, you still had the timber production perspective context, even though you were talking about carbon, but you mentioned future crop trees, for example. Have you been thinking about potentially suggesting this liana cutting even in natural, unmanaged forests? Or are you afraid of the reactions of the biodiversity people?
Well, I think, thank you for the question, Marco. I think I can answer that and the question from Heinrich Speicher as well. We're suggesting that only a small proportion of the trees receive this treatment for biodiversity reasons, but also for cost reasons. If you if you try and cut all the lianas in a hectare, it can take several person days of work. And it's too costly, but also it's costly not only in financial terms, but also in biodiversity terms. So that's why we want to restrict this to just a few trees that are selected. And the other is that it gets the managers focused on the future crop trees. And I think that's critical because a lot of people assume that the next crop is going to come from seeds that are falling and landing in a gap, but we know that's not the case, that they're trees that are already there. So Sabina asks about forest management in Brazil. Yeah, it's hard to know. I know that there are some companies in Brazil and some private landowners that are doing responsible forest management. And as Otávio said before we started this presentation, all logging is called reduced impact logging in Brazil, whether or not it is, but there is a system in Brazil for monitoring logging. It's just hard to know to what extent these practices are being implemented. And that's why I pushed the Real C protocol. We've used that protocol all over the world. In Peru, never in Brazil, as far as I know, but in Central Africa and all over Southeast Asia, to actually get a quantitative, independent assessment of how well real practices are being implemented. And it would be nice to know that in Brazil. I mean, one of the problems in Brazil and elsewhere is that natural forest management is not very profitable. The places that still have forests that could be harvested for timber are often very remote, so you have high harvesting costs. The regulatory burdens I hear complained about all the time is in order to get permits to log legally, it's quite expensive. And so there is a lot of illegal logging, which helps to keep the price of timber down. The log prices are low, partially because the market is saturated with illegally harvested trees. And so trying to move that ahead, but remember, we're talking about remote areas where law enforcement is difficult because they're remote. There are recent advances in remote sensing that make me hopeful. I hope they're remote sensing people who are listening in, because most of the time it seems like they make promises that they can't meet, but we are getting better at mapping and determining where timber is being harvested, looking at even using remote sensing to estimate volumes harvested. So there are elements of law enforcement and reduced impact logging guideline enforcement that could be benefited from remote sensing. But we need to change the culture. And my recommendation of 5 to 10 trees, future crop trees per hectare, there's no magic in those numbers. Could be 20. It's just that usually, at least in primary forest, it's seldom that more than 10 trees per hectare are harvested, but it could be higher than that. One of the problems is if you start harvesting 20 or 30 trees per harvest, it's no longer uneven age, because you basically end up clear cutting, because these are big crown trees. They're not like eucalypts in a plantation. There are a lot of unavoidable damage when they're harvested. So trying to keep the harvests of modest intensity, but then there's the trade-off in profits. If you've already built a road and skid trails, you're going to want to harvest more to take advantage of those high upfront costs. So yeah, nothing magical there. Always a trade-off, and always a trade-off that we need to inform. So there's a question from Estrella about forest audits. I'm a total fan of the Forest Stewardship Council and the voluntary third-party auditing system. I mean, I helped develop it. I did a forest audit, a forest that got certified in 1990, which is 3 years before FSC was founded. But what we're seeing is that, and this is almost an unavoidable effect of bureaucracy and administration, is that the costs of auditing have gone way up. So the cost of getting certified are very high, often prohibitively high, because there's so many criteria and indicators that you need to satisfy, and the process of auditing is costly. Every day you have auditors in the field costs a lot. They need to be paid and transported and housed and all the logistics and all that. It's unavoidably costly. And when we started the Forest Stewardship Council, we believed the results of all these willingness to pay research projects that showed that there was going to be a substantial price premium for wood that was certified as coming from a responsibly managed forest. And that hasn't been forthcoming. And that's a problem. Market access, to some extent, has helped for some markets, but they're typically small markets. So the auditors have 3, 4, 5 days in the field, and they need to check all the housing, the machine use, the safety protocols, the chemical disposal systems, and so forth. There's a lot of things that they have to do, and they depend on the forest owner usually for transport to get out to the forest. So they can't just go to where logging is happening on their own, because and then there's an internal conflict of interest with auditors, because if I were an auditor, I would quickly develop a reputation for being impossible to satisfy, and I would never get another auditing job. And if I worked for a certification body, an auditing body, my auditing body would also not get jobs because it was too rigorous. So the cost gets too high, and there are all these trade-offs. And my focus is on the forest and the forest health and biodiversity, and you need skills to see to know what you're seeing when you're out there. And one of the programs that Tropical Forest Foundation had in Brazil that I really liked was they'd bring auditors and policymakers to the forest in Kawashi to see good forestry, so they knew what it looked like. In Gabon, where I've had the pleasure of working recently, this is something we're proposing. They're well-managed concessions in Gabon. Bring the other people there to see what it looks like, because they don't know, including the auditors. So I hope that.
There are still a couple of short questions, so but if you could answer to those in 1 minute or so, as we have to move on afterwards. At the end, there will be more time for questions for both speakers.
If you cut lianas, they do grow back. A lot of them do sprout. Denver Cayetano is studying that, and other people as well, I think. But 20 years later, we still found that trees that had been liberated from lianas in Guyana were still mostly liana free. So it has benefits, but they do climb, and they climb up each other. The other question that we don't have an answer to is how quickly they weaken so that they don't do damage. They don't pull other trees down when they fall. And LiDAR technology, Hannah, I agree, would be great to use in natural forest management, but the costs are still prohibitive. So, experimentally, we're using it. We don't even have good digital terrain models. So when you're planning skid trails and roads, the topographic maps they're using are terrible because they're based on the top of the canopy, and you're missing a lot of steep terrain. And as we get into steeper and steeper areas, it gets more and more important. So I hope the price of LiDAR goes down. How's that, Markku?
Thank you so much, Jack. And then participants, remember that you can start writing questions during Otávio's presentation already. Amina, to you.
Thank you, Professor Markku, and also Professor Putz for the wonderful discussions around the sustainable forest management issues. Our next speaker will take us to the Brazilian context, and that is Professor Otávio Campoe from Universidade Federal de Lavras. I hope I've done justice. Who will discuss the Brazilian carbon forestry from restorations to plantations. And Professor Otávio's work bridges restoration ecology, which is also plantation forestry and carbon performance in tropical systems. Professor Otávio, please proceed.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here and show a little bit of the Brazilian forestry and the relations with the current carbon issue, carbon discussions, carbon market around the world. I'm going to go through these topics. I'm going to show you a little bit how Brazil biomes are distributed and how we expanded our plantations for production purposes, the distribution, the species, and everything. And then I'm going to connect the 3 plantations for production with the emerging market related to restoration plantations, that some of the companies are the same, and there are new companies planting Brazilian native tree species for carbon credits. And we're going to see that some of the companies are already selling carbon credits to Google, Microsoft, and all these big tech companies. And we're going to integrate how the forestry sector is addressing the topic carbon in Brazil, and how we're planning for the future years. Before I start, it's really important to mention that the results and the data that I'm going to show you today is part of a big collaborative research that we have been doing for almost 2 decades now, integrating universities, research institute, and mainly private companies funding the research that we are doing related to forest plantations for either production or for restoration and in the carbon market. So these maps represent the distribution of biomes in Brazil. On the left side, this is the distribution of biomes that we have. Basically, we have this big green part here in the north part of Brazil, which is the Amazon ecosystem. Here, close to the coast, we have the Atlantic forest, which is also a tropical forest. And then we have this more dry vegetation here in the middle. Here is very dry. Here is a little bit dry. And all this area have kind of savanna type vegetation. And the distribution of our biomes is because this is the distribution of temperature in rainfall. And these distributions of climate and biomes is important to show how our plantations are being distributed and expanding. So as you can see, we are not planting eucalyptus or pine in the Amazon forest. 60% of the Amazon forest is still there, and we are not doing deforestation for eucalyptus or pine plantations or any other commercial species. Now we have about 10.5 million hectares of planted trees for production purposes, and almost 6 million is either FSC or PEFC certified. The forestry sector in Brazil currently plants 1.8 million trees every day, distributed across all these locations across the country. So if you remember, here is Amazon, here is very dry, and so the distribution of our plantations are in this region. So from the 10 million hectares, about 8 million is eucalyptus, several species. 2 million hectares is pine, mostly in the south. And we have 500,000 of other species like rubber tree, teak, and acacia. And the forestry sector in Brazil is receiving a lot of investment. So from the last couple of years up to now, we received $17.5 billion for 4 new pulp and paper mills in Mato Grosso state, which is this state right here. It's about the size of Montana. And by the end of this year, 2.7 million hectares of eucalyptus will be planted in this state. So these huge investments from international investors to companies like Suzano, Eldorado, Bracell, and Arauco are coming to Brazil to produce new mills and plant eucalyptus plantations. But the important issue is that we have a very restrictive legislation related to conservation. So these companies, from big companies to small owners, landowners, we have 10 million planted trees, 10 million hectares of planted trees, but also in the same owned by the same companies and landowners, we have 7 million hectares of conservation forests, focusing on conservations of soil, water resources, and also biodiversity. And as I mentioned, most of our plantations are FSC certified because we export a lot of our products to several different locations in the world. Besides other countries in South America, we export a lot to North America, Europe, and China. And we have been monitoring eucalyptus and pine plantations using multiple advances technology. Someone in the chat mentioned LiDAR. Yes, we are using LiDAR. Several companies have their own LiDAR equipment, and we just published a paper 2-3 weeks ago showing results about LiDAR applications to calculate carbon sequestration and carbon stocks in plantations, mainly in eucalyptus plantation. So we integrate GIS technology, ecovariance towers, ground-based measurements to calculate how much carbon we have stored in our plantations. For example, the 10 million hectares that we have currently have stored 2 billion tons of CO2 equivalent in the whole country, in all the tree plantations. And the average rate of carbon sequestration in Brazilian eucalyptus plantations, for example, is 44 megagrams. Sorry, there's a typo there. 44 megagrams of CO2 equivalent per hectare per year. So this is the productivity level that we have in our forests, and that's why there is a lot of investment in carbon markets in Brazil nowadays, because our forests, they are very, very productive, and the carbon sequestration rates are really, really impressive here. Besides all this monitoring, field measurements, GIS, ecovariance technology, we just published last year a paper on global change biology, improving the biomass expansion factors and root shoot ratios for Brazilian plantations. You all know that IPCC have recommendations for ratios, for numbers to extrapolate from volume to carbon. And for Brazil, we had one single factor for the whole country. So then the companies and the research institute universities, we decided to integrate more than 2,000 trees sampled across the country. And we developed this paper where we have now a spatial distribution of these expansion factors, helping and improving the numbers of carbon sequestration in Brazil, and also helping the companies to improve their estimates of carbon sequestration and the sustainability reports that they are reporting to their investors. And we're not only focused on above and below ground information, we are also studying soil stored, carbon stored in the soil. So we have been monitoring same sites across several decades in several different companies in eucalyptus plantations. And what we see is over all these years is that these plantations, they are being managed in a way that the carbon stock in the soils of eucalyptus plantations are pretty stable. Since we started monitoring, basically on average across the country, we can find around 30 tons of carbon stored in the 30 centimeters of soil. We are putting all this information together in a model called ForestWise. This is it's almost published. We used a study conducting in the Southeast US by our colleagues from North Carolina State. They did this same analysis of life cycle analysis of carbon in forest products. They did it for pine plantations in the Southeast US. And we are doing the same for Brazil. So we are getting all this information together, putting in these models, and we are calculating how much is the life cycle of carbon in several different pulp and paper products. If the trees are being harvested to produce toilet paper, if they're being produced to being harvested to produce fiber boards or any other product, how long this carbon will last in all these products. And we are including or excluding industrial emissions to calculate all these balances. This is about to be published, so you're gonna have this paper pretty soon to check all the details. And as I mentioned, all the companies, they are planting a lot of eucalyptus, a lot of pine across the country, not in Amazon, but across the country. And also they are interested in doing reforestation because they have to. Because in Brazil, our legislation enforces every landowner to have at least 20% of their area covered by conservation forests. And we had a lot of deforestation in the past, and now the companies, they must do reforestation, and they have to select a method. And the most effective method that we have up to now is doing native species plantations, doing a very good silviculture to increase carbon sequestration rates. So here, for example, we are monitoring trials across the country, several trials across the country. We have been monitoring some of these trials for more than 20 years. And on these trials, we are addressing how we can do the proper silviculture for native species, how we mix the species, how we consider the functionality of the species that we are planting, the biodiversity of the species that we are planting. And we have been monitoring these sites, and we are producing several documents to show to the companies how they can do a proper silviculture of native species to maximize carbon sequestration. For example, in these pictures, you can see the difference between a very good silvicultural treatments on the right side and the poor silviculture on the left side. And this is the difference that you can see. After 20 years, the intensive silviculture shows about 160 megagrams of CO2 per hectare, not per year, per hectare. It's about 25 to 30% more carbon compared to a poor silviculture. And also, these very well managed systems, they show more regeneration, and they show a more diverse regeneration too. So with this evaluation of regeneration in these forests, we can see that the ecological processes of natural forests are coming to life again. And these graphs, they show how the growth curve of our plantations are evolving over time, and the sequestration rate of carbon, of CO2, on average over the 20 years is about 8 megagrams of CO2 per hectare per year, plus 10% of the carbon on natural regeneration. And also on these results, we are seeing how important it is to do a very good selection of species, balancing the plantation of pioneers and not pioneers. The pioneers, they are very important at the beginning of the process, but when the time goes by, the pioneers start to die, and the not pioneers trees, the species, they take over the system. For as an example, during the first year of our carbon growth in these trials, 90% of the carbon was in the pioneer species. Now, after 20 years, 50% are in the pioneers. The other 50% of the carbon stored in these systems are due to the not pioneer species that were planted. And the most important thing for us is that the companies are taking these results and they're actually applying in the field. As an example, this is a company called Mombac here in Brazil, and they are using all this information that we produced over the last 2 decades, and they're applying in their plantations in the Amazon ecosystem to do a proper restoration plantation to sell carbon credits. This is a 1.5-year-old plantation in the Amazon. More than 100 different species planted, reaching canopy closure around 2 years after planting. And what they are doing and what the companies are doing is doing a proper selection of high quality seedlings, tree breeding, high technology of silviculture, and also monitoring. We have to monitor all these trees, all these forests to make sure that they are actually sequestering and growing in the way that we want and the way that we expect. And here are some news about companies in Brazil getting thousands, hundreds of millions of dollars to do reforestation plantations in Amazon, in the Atlantic forest, to sell carbon credits to Google, to Microsoft, to Meta, McLaren. All these companies are investing a lot in silviculture of native plantations in Brazil to compensate their emissions. And now what we are doing is we are connecting all this information with climate change. So we are trying to understand for the future how changes in historical climate, rainfall temperature, rainfall temperature and soil water deficit, how these changes and the probability of several different levels of water deficit can impact the carbon sequestration in our plantations. And to summarize, to finish my presentation, I bring here some methods that helped a lot Brazil to develop as a sector to better understand how our forests are impacting the global carbon market, how our forests are sequestering carbon, planted for production, planted for restoration. So over the years, we developed very focused studies with clear objectives. We worked a lot with integration of data from several sources, including private companies' data. They are sharing data with us so we can have a more solid and strong data set to work with. We are also investing a lot in modeling and predictions for the future. And the two main things we need to truly work as an integrated group, as a sector, and mainly training people. So this is the most important thing: train people to work with carbon. Once we retire, train people to move forward with all these studies. If you scan this QR code, you can find our website where all these publications that I showed are there. And if you have any questions, send me an email and just let me know. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Otávio. That was a very rich and intensive presentation. I appreciate the work you're doing. And I'm also in the tropical area here in the drylands, working on restoration and seeing how we can maximize it for livelihood. And right now we are going into carbon exploitation as well. Hopefully we can further discuss more later. Thank you very much to our speakers for the rich and regionally diverse insights. Now, as we transition to the Q&A session moderated by Professor Maku, I would like to pose a framing question to guide the discussion. So, how can silvicultural practices be optimized to create synergies across carbon enhancement, long-term storage and substitution benefits, while ensuring that ecological integrity and social equity? Professor Maku, I invite you to lead the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Amina. We have some 15 minutes left before the closing words of Amina, and we already have 2 questions in the Q&A. Do you want to, very impressive, Otávio, by the way, do you want to read the questions yourself, or should I read them aloud? And others, please keep writing.
Yeah, I can read. The first question is native and indigenous trees in Amazon rainforest do same carbon sequestration? Probably the question is related to compared to eucalyptus. No, for sure it's not. It's mainly because the history of tree breeding in Brazil is different for eucalyptus and for native species. We have been working with eucalyptus since 1960s. And then because of that, we have more than 60 years of investment in research and technology of silviculture and tree breeding for eucalyptus. When you think about native species, in the past, restoration was only used to cover degraded areas. There was no relation with carbon market. So over the last, I don't know, the same 6 years, for example, there was no investment or massive investment in silviculture and tree breeding of native species. Now that the carbon market is emerging as a viable market, the carbon is paying the price for the companies to proper invest in tree breeding, in technology and silviculture for restoration, for the native species. Now, for example, just as an average for you to understand the differences, an eucalyptus plantation on average in Brazil nowadays have a mean annual increment of 40 cubic meters of wood per hectare per year. When you go to a native vegetation plantation, it's around 8 cubic meters per hectare per year. So it's less than a quarter in terms of productivity. But now that we have a clear plan of what we did for eucalyptus, we are planning to do the same thing for native. And we believe that we can move much faster with this whole development of technology and breeding for native species, as we have a clear plan to follow. The second question
Just a second, Otávio. I just mentioned to all the participants that until 22 past, so 4 more minutes, please ask questions to Otávio. After that, broader, more general questions to both speakers. Yes, please, Otávio, sorry.
Thank you. The next question is, plantations in Brazil consist mainly of 2 exotic species. It's 2 exotic genera. We plant several species of eucalyptus and several species of pine, about 15 species of eucalyptus and about 3-4 species of pine. But you're right, they are exotic. Are changes in increasing the number planted expected? For production purposes, no, I don't think so, because the market for production purposes is so well established that it's hard now to convince the companies to include different species or even native species in the market that is already established for eucalyptus and pine plantation. So I think no, it's not expected. But what is expected is the increase in companies planting native species for restoration and also for saw timber production. There's a company here in Brazil called Symbiosis, and they're doing a very good job on planting very good quality native species for saw timber. Good. The next question is, what about the long term of eucalyptus monoculture? What about the carbon levels stored in the soils? Yes, we Anthony and Professor Pro Silva France. Yes, it's a really good question. I mentioned that we have an ecovariance site where we have been measuring for 20 years with everything that you can imagine there, from soil respiration, soil carbon, forest sequestration, everything. And we are about to publish a paper related to this question. What we have been seeing over the years and after multiple rotations is that there is a limit for carbon storage in the system. After you harvest all the wood and take all this wood into the mills, there is a limited amount of carbon that can be stored in the leader layer plus the soil system, which for our plantations, going from leader layer down to 30 centimeters is about 45 tons of carbon per hectare per year. It seems to be stable over rotations, but this is something that we are still working on. Next question.
No more questions to only Otávio. Please, now more general questions. But Otávio, if you could go through the remaining questions for you only.
Excuse me, sorry?
Yeah, if you can answer briefly the 4 remaining questions, but to other participants, now you could write questions to both speakers.
Okay, so Johan is asking, are most of the carbon market demand from voluntary market? Well, the average price for the tons of CO2 is a big secret among the companies. They don't tell us because there's an advantage in market in how much they are selling their credits. So we don't know. Are these plantations done in private land or government? Okay, so for eucalyptus and pine plantations, they are all in private land. However, and also these restoration plantations, they are also being done in private land. But now the Brazilian government are providing land to the companies to do restoration, degraded governmental land. They're providing this land to the companies to do restoration, sell the carbon credits, and share the money with the government. So this is what we are doing nowadays.
I have a question for Otávio, if that's permissible.
Yes, please.
Otávio, there's concern about the hydrological cycle in Brazil, that the natural forest, the water turns over several times, and droughts in southern Brazil due to deforestation in the Amazon. How closely does a plantation mimic a natural forest in terms of hydrology, of especially forest tree atmosphere connections? Are they
That-
similar?
That's a well, depends. That's a great question, because water and eucalyptus plantations is an issue that we have been discussing for 60 years, and it never ends. But I think that is important that never ends, because water resources is mandatory for everything that we do. So if you go to an ecosystem, that level of temperature and rainfall provide resources to a limited amount of trees per hectare. So for example, if you go to the Amazon, or if you go to Atlantic forest, humid Atlantic forest, you can find, let's say, 1,300 trees per hectare, let's say on average. If you go to a savanna type vegetation called Caatinga, it's 400 trees per hectare, 500 trees. So the problem with plantations is that if we plant more trees than that particular ecosystem can support, then we are making a huge problem in terms of hydraulic status of that ecosystem. So the problem is related to how we are managing our plantations, is not and not related to the species. Because if you take the hydraulic of a tree, basically the physical biological system is similar. It's about the same. Fine roots collect water, they go up to the foliage, and then they transpire. So what we are doing nowadays, we are trying to manage our plantations in a way that we never overplant numbers of trees per hectare. And now what the companies are doing is because in the past, we used to do the forest plantation planning at the stand level. And that's a problem, because you must consider the watershed level to do the planning if you want to have production and conservation of soil, water resources, and biodiversity. So now what the companies are doing is they're taking the management level of planning the whole watershed, and now they're dividing the watershed into several different production units or conservation units. So some of the companies, they're not doing clear cutting the whole watershed. So what they do is they do a staggering of planting, and also a staggering of harvesting, and all of them, they have connected conservation areas, trying to minimize the impacts of monoculture into the region. So that's a very good question. Yeah.
We still have 2 minutes for the very broad general questions. Perhaps someone has, and could write in the Q&A. But if not, I would ask the speakers about, now we have talked about very different kind of systems, not about pure natural forests so much, but Jack was talking about managed natural forests. Otávio was talking about recently restored forests and plantations. Very different kinds of forests, and from a hydrological perspective, they are similar, but what about carbon and biodiversity? Could you perhaps compare briefly those from both of your perspectives?
Well, I'd first ask you for clarity, compared to what? Because a intensively managed eucalyptus plantation has very little biodiversity, but if it replaced an overgrazed pasture, then in establishing that plantation, you haven't lost very much. And if you get 40 cubic meters per hectare per year, maybe it's a cost that you're willing to pay, but it's where natural forest with biodiversity is being converted to plantations that I object. And also from a carbon perspective, if you have a degraded forest, it might already have 100 tons of carbon standing, But if you cut it all down and put in a plantation, you never make up what you lost. So it all depends on the starting condition. And Otávio was careful to say that they're not converting forest into plantation or degraded forest. He said degraded land. I'm hoping it's pasture, which there are a lot of in Brazil. Go ahead, Otávio.
Thank you. Yeah, so we have to be honest. In the past, we had a lot of deforestation, a lot of illegal logging, a lot of all sorts of problems related to deforestation. But now we are trying every year, we are trying to reduce illegal logging, we are trying to reduce illegal deforestation. But the main thing that is important for us is we are trying to go back to these areas that we degraded as illegal logging or anything like in the 60s, in the 70s. Now we are mapping all these areas. We're calculating the potential of these areas from degraded pasture up to a regenerated forest or an eucalyptus plantation forest or a pine plantation or a teak or anything. And we are moving our plantations towards these type of systems that are degraded, that have no good quality for, let's say, agriculture or a good quality of pasture. So we are focusing on these systems because we know that they were overused over the last couple of decades, that their productivity level for anything is so low that we need to focus on these locations. And we are trying to get back these degraded systems into some type of system that can be either conservation or production or of any kind of product. Yeah, but it's not an easy task.
Thank you so much from my behalf. Amina.
Thank you. The discussions are very interesting, but as we conclude our webinar today, I would like to sincerely thank our distinguished speakers for their excellent contributions, and to our participants for their engaging discussions and the questions and discussions with the speakers. So we've seen that today's dialogue demonstrates that forest carbon mitigation is not merely about increasing stocks. It is about intelligent, science-based silviculture that integrates ecological, economic, and governance dimensions. So our Carbon 3S framework therefore provides a valuable systems perspective, but its implementation depends on the regional realities and the management choices that we take upon. On behalf of the IUFRO Task Force, thank you for joining us. We look forward to continued collaboration and future discussions. Have a wonderful evening or day wherever you are. Thank you very much.
That was great, Otávio. I really appreciated your presentation. Yeah, there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of this lack of transparency is in the carbon business is really a problem.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
We're facing that everywhere. You know, what is proprietary information? And sometimes I can't understand why it would be proprietary. But it's a dog-eat-dog world in capitalism, and you're trying to sell something. And community-based operations for carbon are floundering all over the world because the cost of the transaction costs are so high.
Yeah.
And that's too bad when you're trying to promote human welfare, but it's tough working with communities. I think that the difficulty has been under-emphasized.
Yeah, and yes, this whole, like, for example, for this restoration plantation companies, we have 3-4 very strong companies doing this, and they are all under the process of being certified by Verra, for example, by Verra. They're not certified yet. Some of them are transitioning to isometric. They're under the process. They're making the protocols. They're receiving visits from several, let's say, people from these certifiers, and it's hard. I mean, from one side, you see a lot of money coming from Microsoft, Google, all these guys, and then on the other side, there are some not very clear methods of certifying from Verra, from isometric. So it's still something that is developing, and this is all voluntary market. And the legislation for regulated market in Brazil was approved about less than a year ago. So now everything seems to be emerging, evolving. Companies are here and there trying to make their names on the market for selling carbon credits, and the prices are so I know that the prices are something that they never tells us, but I heard that there are some companies selling the tons for $50, $55 per ton on these restoration plantations. And then the other issue is that they have a growth curve that we never actually tested, because we have restoration plantations, but no older than 20, 30 years, and they're making a growth curve up to 100 years. So we never know if, for example, in the Amazon, some companies are expecting to reach, after 100 years, 600 tons of CO2.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what they are selling. If you go to the Amazon and you make an inventory and you measure all the trees and blah, 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 a native Amazon forest can go up to 60, oh, it's not 60, 700, 600, 700. Some papers are showing these numbers, but growing from planting trees up to 700 tons in 100 years, I'm not sure.
With no harvesting then at all.
Oh, yeah, they're planning no harvesting, only planting and letting the trees being there, and nature can make whatever nature wants.
On what planet can you have a 80-centimeter diameter mahogany tree that somebody's not going to harvest? My God, it just, yeah.
Yeah, and the contracts, at least here, the contracts are being signed with a 100-year period.
Well, there are still a lot of carbon cowboys out there.
Yeah.
Which is a problem for us trying to make this work in a legitimate fashion.
Yeah. But well, it was a very good discussion. We had, I think, 80 people listening to us, so it was really nice. Yeah, I really,
so.
Yeah.
You didn't address the part of my question I wasn't clear about. I was thinking about the atmospheric river that people talk about. But if you're transpiring water, it's going up into the river. So
Yes.
Seems like it should be.
Yeah. So if you do a proper management, eucalyptus plantation over the rotation can transpire 90% of all the rainfall in a rotation.
Because it's low to start with, and then
yeah, and it goes to the atmosphere, you're right, and produces rainfall, you're right. But the question, and while the issue that people argue with us is that if this watershed have 90% of the rainfall transpired, But if it moves to another region, then you're drying that particular watershed. That's that, yeah, but then another cloud of rainfall can come from another place to your place.
So when you say rotation, you mean 6 years or
6-7 years?
Oh.
6-7 years. Yeah, yeah. We have been measuring that with the ecovariance and some other sap flow measurements in stations and yeah.
Thank you so much, both speakers and all the attendees as well who are still here. Some 40 are still listening. But I guess I have been recording this. Maybe I stop the recording now. I'm not sure is it okay for you both if we share this somewhere at some point? I'm not sure if it's going to happen. We try to do that, I guess. Is it so, Shuirong? We could
Okay for me.
Try to share the recording of the webinar.
Yeah. Yeah, I suppose some audience, they are asking for that, right?
Yes, I promise that I try.
I'd be happy with that.
Yeah, me too. No problem.